what does the damn thing actually do and how does this all work? On the one hand, gear is fun. Of course, we all love gear. But on the other hand, it kind of gets in the way of the creative process sometimes. And if you're constantly thinking or worrying about all those switches and if you might have made a mistake, it's a distraction.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my amazing Canadian co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good, man. How are you?
I'm fine. We've been talking before this episode. It was kind of a rough week, but it's getting better and nothing too crazy. And I think this whole situation causes a little more stress than usual and has some challenges for all of us, I guess. But we got to get through this. So
yeah. Benny's referring to the Corona situation if you're listening to this far in the future.
Oh, yeah.
And I have no idea what we're talking about.
Oh, yeah. So it's got so normal to talk about this, and it's just such a part of daily life that... Yeah, but it could be that it's already over and you don't know what I mean exactly when you're listening to this. Hopefully. It will be. It will be over.
Yeah.
So this topic today is a little different than most of the other hot topics because mostly in a podcast, you try to find topics that are not only helpful, but also kind of exciting or have to do with the art a lot. And that is what it's all about. But today we are doing something that is very valuable and important, but it's on the purely technical side of things, which you don't do very often. But I think it's important because a lot of you reached out and asked for basically explanations for all the switches and buttons and functions of your audio gear. And I totally get that because I remember when I was starting out, it took me a while to really understand all of this and wrap my head around this. And it took a while until I knew when to reach for which button. And it was a lot of trial and error. And there are just a lot of things that are probably not too easy to understand if that's not what you're doing every day, all day, right? So, yeah, we're gonna talk about how your gear what your gear actually does, what the buttons on it do, how to set it up properly, so you will never have to be confused again and be wondering again if you should push a certain button or not when you're recording, right? So, let's start with thinking about an actual typical home recording setup. So you'll probably have an audio interface that has all sorts of inputs, outputs, controls on it. And you probably have a microphone. And if you have a condenser microphone, chances are that this microphone also has, and even some dynamics do, but condensers more often, chances are that there are even switches and buttons on that microphone as well. And yeah, we are going to go through all these functions, all these things, and tell you when to use what and what those are for, basically. And I think we keep it at microphone and interface because yes, there are compressors and EQs and all that stuff, but in a typical home recording scenario, most of you will probably have this combination of mic and interface. So Malcolm, if you look at your interface, what do you see there and what do you use right now and why?
All right. So there's kind of two sections to my interface. The one I've got going right now is an Apollo Twin. So there's kind of a monitoring section and then a preamp section. So the preamp section obviously would control all the incoming noise, where the monitoring section controls everything I'm hearing. So the ones I'm using every day, because I'm mostly on the mastering and mixing side, is the monitoring section.
Yeah.
So there's a big volume knob that everybody's going to have. I'm sure that's the one that everybody's figured out, the one that controls the volume of your speakers. But right now, and I think where we should start to kind of keep things logical, is probably on the input side. So we can kind of work coming into, kind of do a flow coming into the interface and kind of moving through it and touching each of the controls along the way that you might kind of encounter. So I think the first thing to start with would probably be inputs. And on my particular interface, there is the mic and line inputs on the back, as well as like a high Z input on the front. Does that seem like a good spot to start?
Absolutely. That's where the signal goes in. And I think we should absolutely start with the interface and go through all of this in this order. And whatever is left for the microphone, we'll be talking about that later, because some controls on your microphone will actually be redundant or be the same, do the same things as on your interface. So we get through the interface and then see what else there is. So let's start with the input, right? You have plugged a mic into the interface. You probably plugged that into the mic input, and then you used a knob to set the input level, the gain. So probably one of your interface will have some sort of knob there, either a physical knob or some interfaces are controlled digitally. So you might have a digital gain control software or whatever, but you have some way of adjusting the level that's going into your converters. So you have a microphone preamp that amplifies the weak microphone signal that's like coming out of the microphone. It amplifies that and then sends it to your converters, and those convert it to digital and then send that signal to your computer. And the level those converters receive is determined by this gain knob, this input knob. And it's important to note here that in some high-end microphone preamps, there are transformers in there or tubes or components that react differently to different input levels. And so you can achieve different sounds by pushing the gain there, similar to like when you crank the gain on a guitar amp, it's distorting, right? And a subtle version of that, you can also do that with a mic preamp, and with some preamps, not even that subtle. So some preamps you can really drive and distort, and that is not really the case with most like typical interfaces that you would use in a home recording situation, probably. And like most built-in preamps don't do that. They don't have transformers or tubes. They are just clean gain basically, so the sound doesn't really change from low to high. And the converters are good as well, and we are working with 24-bit, which means, without going into the technical details, that there is no decrease in quality if you record quietly. So I would always say, when in doubt, record a little quieter so that you don't risk digital clipping and like unwanted distortion, because you don't have to max out the gain. You don't gain anything by doing that. The preamp won't sound better. You don't have to be careful with the noise floor, because like converters and 24-bit, it's all good. So yeah, just turn it up to a reasonable amount until you get signal in your DAW, leave enough headroom so you don't clip it, and then just record. That's all this knob is for. Just don't clip it, and don't be too risky with it. I
want to drive that home as well. The expensive kind of outboard preamp tends to sound good when you push it. There's kind of normally a sweet spot where things start getting better and a little hairier, but it's the opposite with consumer preamps, where if you push them, it should stay the same, but it's probably just going to get a little more brittle sounding, if anything. And so just don't push them. Record on the extra quiet side with consumer preamps, and you'll be safe.
Yeah. That's great advice. Did you actually find that they sound worse when pushed? Because I've never noticed that, really. I always thought it just you don't gain anything by pushing them, but that's interesting to hear.
I found it with it was the Focusrite Scarlett. I don't know if I should throw them under the bus like that, but I love those boxes. They're so that's probably my most recommended budget preamp would be or budget interface. Go grab a Focusrite Scarlett. They're so affordable and they rock. But I did find that if I recorded quieter, I got better results.
Oh, cool.
Just seemed to be that way to my ears anyways, but maybe I'm crazy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Could very well be, but
the
important message is here, there's no benefit to recording high levels, so just be on the safe side. You will be less nervous because you won't clip. And
the other input on your interface would be the high Z input. I think pretty well every interface has one nowadays. And that is an interface that is designed to take a guitar line right into it kind of thing. So you can grab your guitar and plug your guitar cable right into the interface, and it's going to be ready for that level and take it much better than if you were to like try and convert your guitar to an XLR cable or something like that without a DI. So on my interface, my high Z input is marked from like a little picture of a guitar. So it's pretty obvious that I plug the guitar in there. But it might just say high Z, and that's what it's talking about.
Sure. It might say something like instrument in or inst in or something like that. It's all the same thing. And basically, the important thing to know here is that you are dealing with 3 different kinds of signals, basically. You have mic signals, line signals, and instrument signals, and those are differently. So not every jack input is automatically also an instrument input, because most of them are line ins, and a line signal is already amplified. So there has been some sort of preamplifier that brought it up to line level, because both microphones and instruments put out really, really quiet signals, low levels. And there's a difference in impedance. That's why mic and instrument is not the same. And line is a totally different thing altogether, because there's an impedance difference, and it's also like a stronger signal usually. So just know that, because that's something that many people confuse. I heard people refer to line inputs as like instruments inputs very often, and that's not the case. Don't confuse that. A line in is not for your instrument. A line in is for if you plug in maybe the output from a synth or keyboard or something, or the output of an outboard gear like a compressor or EQ, or like those things have line. They work with line signals, and you can plug outputs of those types of gear into a line input. And but it's different to a microphone and an instrument. And high C means that it's a high impedance input. So yeah, it's just able to handle what comes out of an instrument, of like the signal that a pickup puts out basically on a guitar. And the important thing is here that if you don't do that, it might still work. So you can plug a guitar into the line input, but it will sound differently. So you might not notice that it's the wrong input because it works, but it just sounds completely different. And I've seen people do that in live situations a lot when they plug an acoustic guitar or something directly into the desk, and it works, but it sounds awful in some cases. And
almost all.
Yeah, almost always. And it's like, so if you don't have a high C on your interface, definitely use a DI box and don't use the line ins. And it's always worth being a DI box to that high C input as well, because a good DI box might be much better than the built-in high C.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, so that's always worth it. It's like you have to have a really high impedance, and really good DI boxes have transformers in them, or like have a higher impedance than what the interfaces offer, and the differences are drastic. Like I had a comparison with my Academy beta students. We talked about this on a coaching call, and they got some DI boxes and compared it to their interfaces with like very, very different results. One of them had some DIY DI boxes that he thought were okay, and he compared it to his interface, and the DI boxes completely like lost that comparison. They completely suck compared to the interface. Whoa. And he never knew that. And another one bought a DI box and compared it to his interface, and it made a big difference in the other direction. The DI box was much, much better than the interface. So
right.
Yeah, that's
I mean, in front of me, I've got my Apollo Twin interface. I've got Vintech kind of Neve style external preamp with an instrument in as well. And then I also have a couple DI boxes around, and I've got a Kemper like kind of profiling amplifier. And if I use them all, like they all have their own kind of DI feature, you know, like I can go into the Kemper but still capture DI out of it. They all sound really different. And like to the point where like sometimes I might choose one because of the tonal difference. Like it's like not necessarily like always use this one, it's better. It's like it's different kind of thing. So until you test it, you don't really know.
Sure, absolutely. Sometimes those are switchable on an interface. So it could be that you have a jack input and you can switch it between line and instrument. Or it could be that it's a combination input with like a combo input of XLR and a jack in the middle. And sometimes there's an additional switch there where you switch between mic and instrument so that the interface knows what's actually in there. Some switch automatically, some you have to switch.
Yeah.
So just be careful and know that high Z always stands for high impedance, and that means instrument in.
Yep.
Yeah.
And just because, like, for example, line level is often in a 1/4 inch. So if you think your guitar plugs into that and you're getting high Z, that's not necessarily the case. Just because the jack fits doesn't mean it's meant to go there.
Yeah, exactly.
There could be some jokes made about that. Okay. Get my head out of the gutter. Here we go.
Exactly. All right. So that's the input. That's the high Z. Again, if there's a button that says line, that just means if you push that, the interface expects a higher signal, something that comes out from a preamp or some outboard gear or whatever. So that can also be switchable. So it's basically something like a pad, but it also changes like the impedance. It just makes the interface expect a different kind of signal. And yeah, so mic, line, instrument. All right, then so while we're still at like talking about the preamp, there are some controls that change the signal on the way in. Like they influence the signal like right at the preamp, and those are controls that you find on external preamps as well as on your interface. So with, I don't know what the Apollo has. If I look at my little Steinberg UR22 interface, I actually don't have a polarity button. So I have to do that in my software, in my recording software. All I have is, what do I actually have? I have a high C switch. I don't have a pad. All I have actually is a phantom power 48 volts switch. And that's all there is. So it's pretty minimalistic.
Yep. That's probably most.
That's probably most interfaces, you think?
Well, maybe not. I'm trying to think back to my Focusrite Scarlett. It had a polarity, but I think it had a pad.
Okay. So I only have the 48 volts thing, and that is something that probably every interface has. And what that does is it sends 48 volts, like a voltage, to power your microphone. So if you have a condenser microphone that requires external power, that's called phantom power, the interface is able to supply that microphone with that power. So a dynamic microphone doesn't need that, but a condenser does. And yeah, if you have a condenser plugged in and you're wondering why you're not getting any signal, press that phantom power switch or 48 volts switch, and that will power your interface. There is something to be said about when to not use this. We should talk about that probably, because most interfaces have a switch there and will not have it switched on permanently. And you should, I think, switch it off if you're not using a condenser, right? Or you should have that as your default setting.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty unlikely that you'll have a piece of gear that won't be able to handle getting sent phantom power. So, okay, remember that whenever phantom power is turned on, it's sending electricity. So if the device on the other end that is being sent electricity is not meant to receive that electricity, in theory, there could be problems. Most notably in the audio world, we're talking about ribbon microphones, which are a type of microphone that cannot take electricity, and it will destroy the microphone if it gets too much of it. I have a friend down the road from me that has a beautiful set of Coles, and one of them bit the dust, and we're pretty sure it was because of this. So it's like, it can be really tragic. Really expensive, beautiful microphone was not surviving. He got it repaired, so it's all good. But it was just kind of sad. He was pretty upset.
Oh, yeah. So that's tragic. And I think, I don't know, are there dynamic microphones that can get damaged? I don't think so, right? Dynamics usually
I don't think
take
so
that
either.
very well.
I remember, like, my Kemper, again, this amplifier I have beside me, it can handle it. But I always just kind of err on the side of caution and look up what the specs are on the gear. And the rule of thumb when you're visiting studios and stuff like that is to leave phantom power turned off if you're not using it. So at the end of the day, if you're done, if you still have drum set up or whatever, leave your stuff set up. But once you're striking stuff, kind of throw everything to a default position, and that has phantom power turned off. It's just in case somebody plugs in something into that channel, you don't want to blow it up, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So phantom power always off. unless you're using a condenser mic. So that's, as I said, the only control on my interface really, but you on your Apollo probably have a polarity and a pad switch. So what is that for?
I've got quite a few on here, actually. I love this little box. So polarity we have covered in a couple episodes so far, and that's just like switching the polarity of the signal from positive to negative, which can make sure you don't have signals that are canceling each other out in the phase world. So really that's only really necessary to click when you have like two channels going at once. But as Benny taught us all, you can actually flick that just to see if it does inherently sound better. Like he said, I think a kick drum will push air if it's positive opposed to negative. So, always click that just to see what happens. But generally it's used when you're using more than one channel at the same time. And then pad drops the gain level a certain amount of dB. I actually don't know what gain drop the pad on my Apollo does. I feel like normally it's like -12 or something like that. It doesn't really matter. All that you need to know is that it'll drop the gain of the input so that you have more headroom on your preamp. So if you have like a guitar with active pickups plugged in to your preamp, and it's just clipping with even with all the gain turned down, you can click the pad button, and it'll kind of insert a pad that'll lower the gain of that signal that's coming into the preamp before it hits the preamp, and then you have more room to play with, and you can kind of turn up the preamp to the ideal gain you were looking for. Otherwise, it's just too hot. You're going to be clipping kind of stuff. Some microphones will be like this as well. It's not just active pickups and stuff. It really depends on what you're feeding into it.
I have an API style preamp, a clone, a warm audio, like 312 style preamp, and you cannot record a snare drum with that without the pad. It's just like the original 312 doesn't even have a pad, and so it's always, if you use that on a snare, it sounds great, and it also the distortion sounds great, but you cannot do that without clipping basically because the headroom is not enough. But the clone that I have has a pad, and it's the only option to record a clean like snare drum sound, because without the pad it's just automatically clipping, even if you're all the way to the left. So, but I don't know what about the Apollo. I'm curious, does the pad change the tone a lot? Because with those APIs, I feel like sometimes I use them, but sometimes I don't, and I just accept the clipping because the pad affects the tone, and I sometimes don't like that.
So this is kind of advanced level pad research, but padding totally does affect the tone. Yeah. So in fact, I've done quite a bit of experimenting here. So there's the built-in pad, and then actually, so most of this wasn't done in my studio, or none of it was done in my studio. I just have the one pad; it does the job. But with the APIs, I've got lots of experience with the APIs as well, and they are way too hot, so you have to pad them pretty well for any use. Like, especially the real ones, like the actual API brand ones, are way hotter than the warm even. It's just insane. So there is the option to use external pads, which are like these inline pads that you actually attach onto an XLR cable, and you can throw them that way. You can put them on the input or the output even, which can be cool if you want to really distort things, but then turn them down before they hit a compressor or something. And then there's also other padding devices made, like Little Labs makes this external pad box kind of thing that you can kind of like, they have trim knobs, so you can like do a variable pad kind of thing and kind of find a sweet spot, which is really awesome. And that's the total way to go if you're obsessed about what the pad is doing to your tone. But you guys don't got to worry about that. Once you're like spending, because those API preamps, I think they're like $3,000 per rack kind of thing. Used. So if you're worrying about that, you can start worrying about pads. But really, just flick it. I find with my Apollo Twin, so that's something that some of you might have, the pad does have a slight tone change, but there's kind of usually a sweet spot in the gain where I can get to. So if it's either I've got my gain really low with no pad on, or I turn the pad on and I can ride the gain a little bit higher. And one of those is going to sound better. And you just got to test it each time.
Okay, that's cool. So, but I think for most applications in a DIY recording scenario, it's just a matter of, am I clipping? Yes, then I use the pad. And if not, if I have enough headroom, I just don't use it, right? So,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Well, one last thing to add on that, though, is sometimes you might have, like, say you have a keyboard and you use the pad to turn it down, but you don't like the tone change that happens, which will be subtle, guys. Like, there isn't a big tone change. But if you don't like it, you got to remember that your keyboard probably has a master output that you're feeding into that channel as well. So sometimes it might make more sense to turn it down on the keyboard versus on the preamp. So just be aware of your gain staging.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Totally depends on the source. So if you're talking about making a guitar amp, it gets more tricky because turning down the amp might also mean a tone change, and you got to decide what's the better way to go, like turn down the amp or use a pad, or like you have to test all these combinations, basically get the gain staging right, and then choose whatever sounds best.
Yep.
But with the keyboard and or synth and stuff like that, that's very true, because those outputs will probably not have a sound or not change the sound drastically. And if you can trim those there and not use the gain, not use the pad, it will be probably a cleaner result than having to use a pad instead of turning the output down. Yeah.
Yeah. So another control I've got here is a low cut. So that's built right into my preamp control as well. So a low cut, those are also kind of variable. It depends on your device what that cut's going to be. I think the new two usual places are like 60 hertz and 80 hertz, if I recall correctly, between most microphones and most preamp designs. So all that is doing is really cutting out really some of the sub content of your signal. So on like right now, I should have it engaged because Benedict doesn't need my voice to have this really bassy quality that's just going to kind of mess with things while he's trying to edit this podcast later. Or sorry, Thomas is going to be editing. Sorry, Thomas. But so sometimes you don't need that stuff. So you can just cut it right out, right on the way in, which can be great. And like what are your thoughts on the low cut, Benny? Because some people use it all the time. Some people say they never use it ever. So I'm kind of curious what you do.
Totally depends. Is always a bad answer, but totally depends on the signal and on the actual low cut, because there are in fact much more extreme low cuts than what you are describing. Because if you're talking about 60 hertz or 80 hertz, it's gonna be pretty obvious when you can use it and when you cannot use it. So in theory you could use those low cuts on everything except like bass guitar or bass drum or like a sub synth or whatever, because everything else basically doesn't need anything below 80 or so. But there is, and without becoming like too nerdy and getting too much into the details here, a low cut always also does something to the phase, always changes the phase a bit. So if you're recording multiple signals, you have to be careful with that. So let's say you have two inputs, or you have an interface with 8 inputs, or a digital recording desk, what some people have in their jam spaces or something like that. And let's say you record a drum kit, and you have a mic on the snare top and on the snare bottom, and you have a lot of bass drum bleed on the bottom snare drum mic, for example, and you want to get rid of that. So you use the low cut to filter out the kick there, and you don't use that low cut on the snare top. It could be that you just reversed the polarity, basically, and you have to check for that, because a low cut changes the polarity, the phase, and not the polarity, but the phase, and that could result in basically a 180-degree switch sometimes. And there's that, and there's also resonance that's happening. So right at the frequency where this low cut kicks in, right? If it's an 80 hertz low cut, at 80 hertz or somewhere around that frequency, there could be a slight boost, and that could be cool, and you can use that creatively. In fact, so if you have a kick drum and a pretty low cut, and you use that low cut, you might get rid of some of the very low sub rumble if you don't need that, but you might actually get a slight boost in a more useful area of the kick drum, or if the low cut is higher up, you could get a boost where the body of the snare drum is, but get rid of whatever is below that. Same with a guitar amp, you can get a little more of this, like the feeling of air moving and the the oomph of the guitar speaker, but you get rid of everything below that. So a low cut does not only remove low frequencies and does that cleanly, but most of the time it has side effects, and those can be good or not so good. So you always should just try what the low cut does and really hear for all the different things, not only for the low end, but also what changes above and what changes in the relationship to other signals and what changes at that spot where the low cut actually is. So it's not it's hard to give good advice here because it totally depends on the situation. And there are things, right. I was just looking up like the SM7 because you are talking into an SM7 microphone and it has a low cut switch on the microphone.
It does. Let's see if it's on.
Is it on?
No, it is flat.
It is flat. Yeah, I figured because I use that microphone in the studio as well. And in the first couple of episodes we did, I always used that and you did as well. And your voice has had much more low end. And that's partly because you have a lower voice, but also because I used that low cut. And I always use it because I don't know, for spoken word stuff, for podcast stuff, I feel like most of the time I don't need that much low end. But I wasn't actually aware of how drastic that low cut on the SM7 really is for a voice, because that low cut on the SM7 I think starts at 300 or something. So
oh wow.
Yeah. So it's a roll off and not a steep cut, but still, if you would use that on snare drum or something, you would definitely notice a big difference. So It totally depends on the gear and on the input signal.
I think there's a little bit of even the room, not so much with the SM7 here, but my condenser microphone in my vocal booth. I have a pretty small, tight vocal booth, and I find that I'm using the low cut in there because I don't like how the low frequencies build up, even on a voice. And then the other reason I also play with the low cut is it does affect how it might hit hardware after the fact. So if you're recording into a compressor, you might get a different result by having less low-end information triggering the compression. So I play with it a little bit in those situations as well.
All right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. I don't know. What should we recommend people do with the low cut?
You got to try it. Yeah, totally. And if you can't hear the difference, then it's probably not a noticeable enough difference to care.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the low cut. And also the last thing to add to this here, you might have a variable low cut. It's because I know that some of the more modern interfaces or some of the desks have actually control for the low cut. And you have to be really, it's just super nice, but you have to really be really careful with that because you can easily destroy things. Because one thing I think we should say here, is that you should be careful, because if you have too much low end recorded, you can always, most of the time, remove that after the fact pretty easily with a low cut filter in the DAW and during mixing or whatever. But if you accidentally set a low cut filter too high, then those frequencies are gone and you can't really bring them back. So when in doubt, I would rather leave it off than turn it on. And if you have a variable low cut, I would find what I usually do is I would start very low, then I would turn the control, move the frequency where it sets in, move it up. And when I notice a decrease in low frequencies, I go back a little and then I leave it there so that it's not really audible. But so I just know it gets rid of whatever is below the stuff that I need, but it doesn't really cut into the signal that I want to use.
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it, because low cut isn't really to make something sound less bassy. It's to get rid of stuff that is irrelevant. So there might be just this little rumbling of low content that you can't even perceive, but it does kind of all start to stack up inside of a mix when you've got a bunch of tracks that all have this little bit of rumble. So if you can just kind of clean that up, then that's not going to present itself as a problem later on.
Sure, absolutely. And you should do that in your recording, because many people might ask, do I do that now in recording or do I do it in the mix? So I would say if there is no gear in the chain other than the mic and the preamp, it doesn't matter as much. But if you have if you are recording into, or if you're sending the signal from the mic preamp into a compressor and record that, for example, then it totally makes a difference if there's the low cut before that compressor or after it, because the compressor reacts differently to the low end. So in case you are using like any effects, outboard gear, whatever, after the preamp, it matters much more. If there's nothing in the chain, yeah, it doesn't really matter that much. It's nice to have like cleaned up signals, and the rough mix will sound better immediately. So you could definitely get rid of stuff, and it's not a bad idea to do that, and if you're careful. But if you are using gear after the preamp, it gets much more important, because a compressor might grab the signal and turn it down a couple dB just because of some low rumble stuff that's going on that doesn't really belong to the actual signal that you want to record, and it totally changes the compressor's behavior. So
the last thing I think we haven't talked about for inputs is the link button, which only some interfaces have as well. But what that does is essentially it links a pair of preamps together so that they can be controlled as if they're one. So the most common uses of this is something like drum overheads, where you have two mics above the drum, or maybe like an XY pair of microphones on a guitar. But essentially, when you have two microphones, but you kind of want them to be doing the same thing, and they're probably placed in like the same place or in relation to the instrument, they're like the same distance kind of thing. And that just lets you grab one control and turn both of them up or down. And all their other controls should link as well. So if you flip the polarity, it'll do it to both channels as well. So whenever you have like a pair of mics doing the same job, or they could be, a left and a right out of a keyboard into it, where obviously if you flipped the polarity, you'd want to do it to both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes this control can be on the interface. Most of the time it will probably be in the software, the control software or the monitoring software of the interface. So it's often a digital control, but wherever it is, it just means one control for two channels.
Yeah. All it does is makes workflow a little bit easier. It's not necessary to use it if like you can still use a pair of mics without that button, obviously, but it just kind of speeds up the process.
Sure. All right. Then one more thing that just came to mind, but we have to say it, is, by the way, going back to the low cut real quick, a high pass and a low cut are the same thing. That's important to say, because that can be very confusing. And I remember myself, like, I was confused by that as well when I started out. So it's the same thing. And if you think about it literally, like it's logical and it's clear, but it's still confusing. So low cut, you cut the lows. High pass, you let the highs pass through. So it's the same thing. It's just two different terms for exactly the same thing. Yeah, it's a little weird why two of these terms exist, but on some interfaces it says low cut and on others high pass, but it does mean the same thing.
Yeah, and same goes for low pass, and high cut. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. Okay, so then what else do we have? So as I said, on my interface, there's no more switches, basically. All I have left is a mix control. And what that does on my interface is it lets me dial in a headphone mix, or it lets me choose what I'm hearing on my headphones, and it lets me blend between the input, like whatever comes into the mic or instrument or line inputs, and the DAW. So on my interface it says input and DAW, and that means whatever comes from the computer through my digital to analog converters and arrives at the interface. So I can monitor through the interface without going into the computer. So I can do a hardware monitoring, which means no latency, which also means no effects and just a dry signal that I'm hearing from the microphone. So I can use that, or I can monitor through the computer, through the DAW, and hear what's going on there, and I can blend between the two. And many interfaces will give you that option. And with some interfaces, there is not a blend control, but just a switch where you can choose direct monitoring or not. And I think the most important thing here is just know that you have this option and don't use two things at once accidentally, because that's what many people do. Many people will switch on like direct monitoring and also monitor through the DAW, for example, and then they hear this weird delay and don't know why that is.
Yeah.
So they're hearing themselves twice, or it might sound like a chorus or phaser type of effect. And so choose one. I don't know. Do you have a preference there? I honestly never really use the direct monitoring feature. I always monitor through the DAW or at least the software of my interface, because I want to have, most of the time I want to hear compression or reverb or whatever on the monitoring.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I monitor through Pro Tools, and that lets me use some plugins and stuff as long as I keep an eye on the latency, right? So no real thoughts there, but some people, like if your computer can't handle monitoring through the DAW, I think it's probably necessary to use. On my old Focusrite Scarlett that I used to have, I think it was just like a little switch that said direct input monitoring, but it was kind of a pain to dial in. It's just easier in the DAW for me. Sometimes, though, we should mention, like with my Apollo here, the monitoring is controlled in the computer, not on the interface itself. So they have like a direct monitoring kind of setup, but it's through a little software they include with their product. There's no controls for it on the actual interface, the physical interface.
Okay, yeah, but it's exactly the same thing. It's just digitally controlled. I think that if your computer can handle that, I would always monitor through the DAW and even if you're not using compression or reverb or anything or plugins while you're recording, it just safer to me, and it kind of makes me nervous not hearing what I actually record, because there might be an error or something going on and you just don't notice it because you are listening to what your preamp does on the interface, but you don't listen to what the converters do, what the computer does. So I always feel better if I hear it like off tape, what would be the term,
right,
like for that. So I'd like to hear the whole thing, like as it's recorded.
There's one kind of, to be the devil's advocate, I have noticed, and I was told about this as well, that with vocals especially, when there's any latency, it's more noticeable than like any other instrument. And the more latency you have, so when you are monitoring through your DAW, by the way, there's going to be probably some latency just because of processing throughout the session. And normally it's like not very, like it's a low amount and we can't really perceive it. But with a voice, because it comes from the kind of inside of you, it starts to kind of feel like your voice is coming from like right in front of your face instead. And that kind of is a weird experience for singers who aren't used to that. So I've been kind of starting to experiment with monitoring directly for vocals versus the DAW, but everything else I just throw in the DAW and everybody does fine with it. But I'll keep you posted on how that turns out. Right now I'm doing it actually. I'm listening to my voice from the direct input monitoring instead of my DAW, and it feels great.
Yeah, I'm listening to the DAW, and I have like, I don't know, 3 milliseconds or whatever latency.
Oh, that's pretty good.
That's good, yeah. But still, it's different than no latency, right? So yeah, totally true. Okay, so we have that. So we have some sort of direct monitoring functionality that you probably have on a modern interface. What else do you have? Like, so that's basically it for me. I have the volume. You've already said that. I have a separate volume for phones. That's pretty obvious. Don't need to explain that probably. So there's in addition to the outputs for the speakers, there's a phones output, headphones output, and it has a separate volume control. But it's pretty obvious what that does.
There is on mine. I don't think most of these have this, but it's one of the reasons I love this little box so much. On my monitoring side, I have a dim button, which just takes the overall level of your speakers and just drops it. And you can actually, in my kind of software controller, I can set what that level is dropped to. So that's really useful in the mixing and mastering world, because you can just like do a little listen check at a different volume, and our ears perceive like balances and frequencies differently at different volumes. So it's kind of a good little gut check to be like, okay, oh, that's really loud. Now, I couldn't tell when it was at full volume, but when I listen to it quietly, the bass is like 4 dB too loud kind of thing. So that's super valuable to me. I never use it when I'm tracking though. So definitely not that necessary.
Yeah.
Do you ever...
Yeah. Sorry.
Do you dimming? You look like you were going to say something, so I wanted to see if you use it when you're tracking.
Yeah, I do. Just for one reason, because like the main benefit for me from a DIMM switch is I don't have it on this little portable interface here, but in my studio I have it and on my monitor controller. And the main benefit here is to me that most monitor controllers, unless they are digitally controlled or they have a switch instead of a pot, a volume pot, they will. So every pot, no matter how like no matter the quality, even the high end ones, will have differences in the stereo image when you turn the volume down to very low volumes. Like at some point at the very, very bottom, like very low volumes, one of the two channels will die earlier, or will like the stereo image will not be the same anymore. So you'll notice when you turn the interface down that one speaker will suddenly get quieter than the other one. And sometimes I want to check things really, 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 really quiet, even during tracking. So just when I listen back to what I just tracked, and there are just some things. So for example, high-end distortion, like cymbals and stuff like that, I can only really hear the subtle things in there when I listen really, really quietly. And when I do that with I have a good monitor controller, but if I do that with the pot, if I turn the volume down, the stereo image is not right anymore. So, but with the DIMM switch, I can do that. I can turn it down until it's to a point where it's quiet, but still like everything's okay. And then I hit the DIMM button, and then it will go really, really quiet, but with the stereo image intact. So that's what I like to use it for. If you have a very expensive monitor controller with like switches instead of a pot, this doesn't happen. And if you have a digitally controlled one, it also doesn't happen. But with the usual normal monitor controllers or volume controls, this will be the case.
Yeah. I think it's probably something that even like the lower quality your interface, the more that kind of stereo image disjointing becomes apparent. My Focusrite Scarlett was not very good on that front. It was like, oh my God, this is not balanced, not balanced, not balanced. Okay, we're getting closer, but
yeah,
it's like, it was pretty tragic. I mean, it's not going to stop you from making a good record, but it might stop you from mixing one.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, it can be a useful thing. And if you're wondering what that does, that's all it does. It's like a pad for the monitor output, right? It just lowers somewhat the output that goes to your speakers or headphones.
Yes. And then I've also got another one that I really love is a mono button.
Oh yeah.
So a mono button just sums what you're hearing to mono instead of stereo. So everything seems like it's coming up the middle. In fact, it's just both speakers playing the same information. But that is also really useful in the mixing and mastering realm because, again, we will be able to kind of perceive things differently. It's also kind of like a listen check because a lot of people listen to music on mono devices like phones and stuff like that. So you can kind of get an idea of what's going to happen when it is played back that way. You might notice that some things are louder or quieter. So really useful for that. It's also useful in tracking though, because I find it a lot easier to check phase and polarity changes in mono. I don't really even know why that is, but it just is. flick it to mono and then check the phase, and it's just pretty obvious when what happens to the low end, especially.
Yeah, agreed. Nothing more to add to this. If you have it,
it's a great button. Not a lot of interfaces have it though, unfortunately.
Yeah, true. And I think it's also more of a mixing thing. But as you said, it's true. It's useful in tracking. Absolutely, checking phase and it's in mono is great, and also arranging stuff. So when you are recording and you're wondering where, like when you're creating tones, exactly, especially when you are engineering tones and try to fit the guitar tone or whatever into the arrangement, mono can be useful because in stereo you can kind of trick yourself a little bit because it might sound, you might be able to hear everything and it might sound like a good arrangement, like frequency wise and everything. But when you hit mono and everything collapses to the middle, some things might be disappearing or be masked by other things. And if you can still hear everything when it's in mono, that's most of the time that's a good sign. And so it's helpful also for recording.
Yeah, there's people that mix exclusively in mono, which I find just insane and unpleasant, but there's definitely something to it. People are making it work.
Yeah.
And the last thing I've got here for my controller is a talkback button, which can be really handy. Like for me, it's essential. I would never have an interface without a talkback system. You can have an external talkback system, so it's not the end of the world. And in a lot of cases, like my old place, the guy was just singing right behind my head, so I could just turn around and talk to him. But if you have a multi-room thing going on, it's so awesome to have a talkback button that you can just reach over and click, like while your other hand's on the mouse still working away or whatever. So, but that, self-explanatory. Everybody knows what their talk button is if they have one.
Yeah. There's just some, I don't know. You said you always use it. For some reason, most of the time I've set up like separate talkback chains basically, or I used a separate talkback mic and routed that to a channel just because I don't know your setup, but if you're using multiple rooms, and that's probably not the case for many people recording at home, but if you're using multiple rooms, you might have a patch bay and you might have a wall box or something in the other room, or you might have a snake or some multi-core cable of some sort in the other room, and the talkback from your interface or your controller might not have a separate output, and it might not be routed through there to the other room and stuff, and so the headphones in the recording room might not be directly connected to the interface or the monitor controller,
right.
And if that's not the case, the talkback doesn't work. So the talkback is only if you can connect the headphones directly to the device with the talkback button, right?
Yes. Yeah. It works in my situation, but I see your point for sure.
Yeah, because I say that because when I was starting out in our rehearsal room, it was not a proper studio. It was a total DIY situation, but we had like two rooms, and I just ran a snake, like a multi-core cable that you would use for live applications usually, from the practice room to a corner in another room where my desk was, and I had my interface there, but with a talkback, but I couldn't run like the whole headphone and monitoring thing and everything was different, and it was not directly on the monitor controller, so right. I never really used that talkback, but I just set up a different mic and plugged it into a preamp, and then ran the output of that preamp to the other room.
Right.
Yeah. So
yeah. I mean, there's 100 ways you can solve the talkback problem. For example, the studio I interned at has this big Avid Digi Command like controller console kind of thing, and it's got an auto talkback in it. So as soon as you click stop record, and there's no recording going on, talkback turns on, so you're just like seamlessly talking with the talent. As soon as you click record, it turns off, so you can talk to the producer on the couch without distracting the players as they try and lay down a take. It's so awesome, but that's a luxury.
Yep. But I have a very awesome tip here, and I have to just look it up.
I know what you're talking about.
I just totally forgot what the plugin is called.
Mutomatic.
Yes, exactly.
Sound
Mutomatic. It's exactly what you just described.
Yeah. It's so that's a plugin. It's a free plugin, by the way, that you can download, and you can just insert it on any channel in your DAW, and it'll link to your transport. So if you stop recording, it opens up the channel, and you can talk to the talent, and then when you click record, it'll kill any audio trying to pass through that chain. So it does exactly that, and it's free. It's awesome. I'm just gonna Google it real quick to make sure that we're calling out the right company. Sound Radix Mutomatic. Yep, it is Sound Radix Mutomatic. Yeah. There you go. So free
Super
download.
Useful.
Go grab it.
Super useful. So you can make it work the other way around, so that it is quiet when you are not recording, and you only hear it when you are recording. So that can also be useful if you're monitoring through the DAW, and you have, for example, a very compressed microphone on the drums or whatever in the tracking room, and you only want to hear that when you're playing, but you're not in between, or I don't know, could be various things. So you can set up this plugin both ways, and it's just super useful.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. But that's a little off topic, but just wanted to give you guys that. All right, then basically that's it for most of the common controls. I want to add two pretty specific things here, though, that are useful for you, or can be useful for you. And one is with many of these portable small interfaces, like the one that I use. It's the Steinberg, but that's the company that makes Cubase, the recording software, and they also have interfaces, and it's the UR22 MK2. And it is bus powered, and so are the Scarlett interfaces and some other interfaces in that category. And bus powered means you don't need to use a power supply. You can just plug it to the USB of your computer, and it will get power from the computer, and that works. And it's also enough to power your microphones, condenser microphones, use the phantom power and everything. But and they don't really tell you that, but I just found it out by accident, I think, and then I read about it, and it's true. If you are using an interface bus powered, it has less headroom. The preamps have less headroom than if you use it with a power supply. And I noticed it when I was plugging in my bass into the high C input and a guitar with active EMG pickups. And even with the gain all the way to the left, I was constantly clipping. And it got pretty frustrating, and I didn't know why that was. And then I Googled it, and I found that I should use a power supply. And I used the power supply, and gone was the clipping. So the power you get from USB is just not enough to power the preamps properly, I guess, to handle high volume. So whatever the technical background there is, we don't want to get into this, but just know that if you have issues with the headroom, if you're clipping, try using a power supply instead of bus powered.
I love when I learn new stuff on this podcast.
Yeah, and I'd say that
awesome.
in this episode, because I have a control for that on the back of my interface, where I can switch the power source between external and the USB bus powered. And that totally changes the behavior of the interface.
That's great. And for people confused by this, dynamic range or headroom is like the dynamic range you have going into your interface. So if you have less dynamic range, that means that you have a smaller threshold of gain that can be inputted into the preamp without clipping occurring. So the more dynamic range and headroom, the better.
Sure. Exactly. So the second and last thing here before we go to the controls and the microphone is a ground lift switch that you might have on your DI box. And I don't know if there's one on interfaces. I haven't seen one, I think. But there is one on things like preamps for bass guitar, on some power amps, DI boxes. I think the Kemper has one. I'm not sure.
Kemper's
about
got
that.
like 4.
Sorry?
There's a ground lift on each output of the Kemper, so there's like 4 different ground lifts on the Kemper.
So yeah, so and what that does is, again, we don't explain the technical details. You don't need to know that really. It's just too complicated. But all you need to know is whenever you are running multiple electronic or electric devices, like say you have a guitar amp and you have your interface, a preamp, whatever, and you plug the guitar amp into one power, what's the word, wall, socket, whatever, power outlet, and you plug the interface into another one, there could be hum issues. There could be issues with the ground, and like you could just hear hum and noise. And if that happens, try plugging everything into the same outlet, or use like some sort of power distribution that prevents you from getting that hum in the first place. And if that's not possible, try using the ground lift switch, because that often solves the problem. And so basically, whenever you hear hum, try both positions of that ground lift switch, and usually there's one that's better, and you just use that.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to do whatever it takes to get rid of hums, like run an extension cable to the tracking room to get power. Because if the DI, like for example, if you're running a combo amp in a different room and you've got a DI in that room as well, the DI is going to be attached to the power of your interface and your preamps and stuff like that, where the amp's going to be plugged in that other room, which might not work out. So that ground lift might be the solution. And if that doesn't work, run an extension cable in there, get them on the same power. Do whatever it takes.
Yeah. And one more thing here to add, because I run into this, and it's also something I wasn't aware of. Some active DI boxes you can power, like they are phantom powered, so you can use them with either a battery, or you can power them with the phantom power from the interface, just as a condenser microphone. But if you, and that's not for every DI box, and I don't know why that is for some DI boxes and some others not, but some DI boxes, if you use the ground lift, the phantom power doesn't work anymore. You have to use a battery then, because I guess I don't know. I don't want to explain it here because it's probably wrong, but I just know that it's the case. So with some DI boxes, you cannot run them with phantom power if you use the ground lift. So if you are using the ground lift and you're wondering why you don't get any signal, just try using a battery instead of the phantom power.
Good to know, because that would just drive me mad if I ever encountered it.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. All right. So that's it. And then the last thing here
I've got one thing to add.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, this is kind of, it's totally unrelated, actually, I'm going to be honest, but it's the kind of, like, if you're worried about buzzing stuff and ground lifts, this will apply to you. Dimmers in studios can cause buzzing as well, like dimmer lights switches. So if, like, because they essentially cut harmonics, the dimmers, right? So if you're having this weird, crappy buzz that you can't get rid of, ground switches, whatever, try turning off the lights. It'll probably help. So I make people track in the dark all the time, but
totally true.
Yeah.
And bad power distribution. Like what's the? Sometimes I just don't know the words. you're
like faulty wiring. Like, I mean, the old houses with bad, like, power routing and whatever. There could be a million cases. For example, I live on a farm. Studio down the road from me has a farm, and if there was an electric fence turned on the property, my electric guitars will have a tick, a periodic.
Yeah, and
it's the worst.
Yeah.
So I have to risk, like, animals escaping every time I record guitars.
That's good. That's cool. Okay, so then let's move on to mics real quick and then wrap it up for this pretty technical, but I hope very helpful episode, though. Because we have basically covered everything that you will find on a mic, because most mics have, if they have switches at all, they will have maybe a low cut or high pass, which is the same thing as we learned, or they have a pad so that you can make microphones work for loud sources. Many condenser microphones will have that, because if you put it on if you use them as an overhead or in front of loud guitar amps, you might have to use the pad. But microphones sometimes have one more option, one more control that interfaces typically don't have, and that is a polar pattern switch.
So a lot of condenser microphones are multi-pattern microphones where you can change the kind of polar response of them. A cardioid polar pattern is like a kind of a circle facing you with an indent at the back, and that is the most common polar pattern for a microphone. And essentially what these diagrams represent is what is getting picked up by the microphone and what is being rejected. And the kind of like triangle indent out the back of the circle is the rejection axis. So by changing your microphone's polar pattern to these different shapes, you can essentially change what that microphone's going to be targeting or rejecting, which can be really useful, especially if you're recording like multi-instruments, say a vocalist and a guitar. So somebody's got an acoustic guitar and they're singing, and you have to somehow mic both of those things while trying to get as much isolation into those microphones as possible. These patterns that you get creative and attempt things like that. But they also just sound different as well.
Yeah, the frequency response is different in on and off axis with a microphone. So, and you get differences in the proximity effect. So if you get closer to the mic, it's going to be more bassy. If you move away from the mic, you have less bass. And I think that's not totally correct, but it's, as a rule of thumb, the more directional a mic is, the more you have that proximity effect. And with an omnidirectional mic, you won't have it as much. Figure of 8, like as ribbon microphones, have a very strong proximity effect. Omnidirectional, like measurement microphones, something like that, don't have a proximity effect at all. So that's a difference. And what's like bleed from the back of the microphone sounds differently than stuff that comes in from the front if you have a directional microphone. So if you have, for example, a mic on the snare drum, the hi-hat in the back of the mic will sound differently than if the mic would be pointing directly at the hi-hat. It's just a different sound. So yeah, it's a control that lets you decide what the microphone picks up or is more sensitive to. And if you have the option to change this stuff, it helps with, it gives you more like positioning options basically, because if you're stuck with one pattern, well, that's it, and you have to position the mic in a way that works. But if you can switch it, you can do different things with it. Like, so you could use it to reject stuff you don't want to have in your recording, or you could use it to grab stuff that's coming from another side. So you could use it to get more of the room sound, or if you want to capture something that's in the back of the microphone, for example, you can use a figure of 8. Again, I think we should do, or we totally will do probably an episode on microphones and microphone placement and stuff like that. And we can talk about that in more detail then. But basically, yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe we should touch on like the 3 most common, like cardioid, omni, and figure 8, just so people have a really basic understanding of what those are. So cardioid is like 90% of microphones, let's say. A lot of them. Your SM57s and stuff like that are all cardioid as well. Like, are all dynamic microphones cardioid actually?
No, definitely not. There is one. Most of them are, and I don't know if you have to do, like, if it's difficult to make them not cardioid, or I don't know. But I know that there are some that are not. For example, one of my favorite like trash mics, I call them, like you can throw those type of mics that you can throw like in the center of the drum kit and compress really hard and stuff like that. There's a classic Sennheiser MD21, I think it's called. So not the 421, but just 21. Okay. And there's a reissue of that, I think. I'm just Googling it if I'm correct. And that's a dynamic omnidirectional microphone.
Cool. Very cool.
For example. So,
yeah. So, but cardioid is kind of most of them, and that is like your classic directional microphone. You point it at the thing you want to record, and they generally reject what they're not pointed at quite well. So that makes them great on stage and live environments, and just great in most cases, drum kits and stuff like that. If you have a SM57 stuffed up against the snare, it's probably not going to really get a bunch of tom drums into it or anything like that. So they're great for that. Omni hears all around it. So that would be the worst thing in a lot of those situations I just put out. But, they can be really cool. If you ever have seen like a bluegrass band or anything like that, or like you've seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, that George Clooney movie, they're all singing around one microphone. That's an Omni microphone. And it kind of hears everything around it. So it's really cool in those kind of environments where you just want to like capture what's actually happening in the room. And then figure 8 is actually one of my favorites. I love figure 8 microphones. They hear on the front and the back, but they reject the sides really, really well. I find that they reject the best on like, but only where the rejection access is. They hear it at the front of the back really well. But like stuff like that can be so cool. Like if going back to having an acoustic guitar player and that who's also singing, if you get a figure 8, 2 figure 8s, and one's on the voice with the null point of the microphone pointed at the guitar, and then one on the guitar with the null pointed at the voice, you can get an amazingly isolated vocal with these two, and isolated guitar with these 2 microphones that I don't know if you could do any other way. So they have a place for sure.
Sure, I love figure of 8 for that reason. Also, if you want to get a really wide drum image, figure of 8 overheads are so cool for that reason, because you can really pick up what's below that one of the microphones, and the other side of the drum kit, you can reject that really well. And if you then pan the 2 apart, it's going to result in a really, really wide, very detailed drum image. And love it. But you have to be careful though, because you will pick up what's above the kit. So if you have an untreated wall very close to the kit, it's gonna be a catastrophe. But if you have a cloud up there or high ceilings, this can work really well. And I love ribbon mics on drums for that reason, partly.
Yeah. They're also my favorite room mics as well. They're great for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like Benny, you might have even been the one that told me about this, but apparently, the guys in the Beatles got like a custom microphone made by Neumann or something that was a figure 8, so that they could sing together, like face to face kind of thing, and sing. Like looking into each other's eyes, because that's how they got their vocals so tight, was like they were just like literally singing it together in the same room, like a foot apart from each other.
Oh wow, no, it wasn't me, but interesting to hear.
Very interesting to hear. That would have been a nightmare to try and mix and balance them, but yeah, that's what I heard.
Yeah, but yeah, again, if the performance is great and if you're recording the Beatles, it's probably not that hard to balance them.
So they probably did it themselves.
Yeah, cool. So I think that's all we need to know for now with those polo patterns. I'm just thinking if there's any other switch that we might have forgotten, but I don't think so. Mics don't usually have more than these options and interfaces. We've covered pretty well also.
Yeah, no, we totally got it. There is sometimes like a tone switch, like there's a Sound Deluxe U195 microphone. I don't even know if it's meant to be modeling something or its own thing, but it's a beautiful mic, and it's got like a fat switch, which does a little low end shaping. So occasionally you'll find stuff like that, but they're pretty, self-apparent to what they actually do, and they're uncommon as well.
Yeah, and yeah. That tone switch reminds me of another thing that can happen, and I have that on my Warm Audio preamp that what I was talking about. And there, yes. I know that there are in the cheaper preamps with the Audient preamps, I think, and some others have that as well. You might have an impedance switch for the microphone. There could be something like a tone switch. It might be called tone, but what it does is, because I think on my Warm Audio it's called tone. I'm not really sure, but I think. And what it does is it changes the impedance. So there are microphones with higher and lower impedances, and like if you change the impedance on the preamp, it just changes the frequency response at the sound of the microphone. And you can use that creatively, so you can use a mismatch on purpose. It doesn't damage anything, it just sounds different. Or you can use it properly, whatever sounds better. But it's if you have that option there, just try it. It's like you can't do anything, you can't damage anything. Just try it, because especially with ribbons or older microphones, they might have a different impedance than modern condenser microphones, for example. And if your interface or preamp gives you that option, just try it out, and you might get much more level, or you might get a more detailed high end or whatever. Just try it out. It completely changes the sound of your microphone. Some even have like a variable impedance, like the Focusrite ISA preamps, I think they have an impedance control, not only two positions of a switch.
Right.
But it's all the same thing. It just, you can match or like cause a mismatch of impedance there, and it just changes the way your microphone sounds. So
it's kind of like the polarity switch, where it's just always worth clicking, just to see what happens.
Exactly. Cool. That's been great. I think we went longer than I wanted this to be, but it was. I think we didn't say anything like redundant, or I think it was. I hope it was helpful. And if you wanna learn more about these things, or if we totally missed something, or if something is still not clear, I have made a blog post and essentially a series of posts as kind of a resource to look up things like that. And if you go to theselfrecordingband.com/audio terms explained, you will find an article, and that article is called "What Does the Damn Thing Actually Do and How Does This All Work?" And this article is basically exactly about what we've been talking in this episode. It's also on the sidebar on the right of most of my blog posts, and I have it there because in case somebody reads something and just doesn't know what I'm talking about in the article, you can just look up these things. And it's basically a monster blog post divided into 6 different posts, and you have an index there. You can search for things. You have categories like general audio terms, terms that belong to like the production process and all the phases you go through during this process. There's routing and processing, microphones and mic accessories, preamps, converters, interfaces, cables, connectors, computer software, audio files. So all that stuff. It's basically like a glossary or something like that. And you, So whenever you come across a term or something on your gear that you just don't understand, go to that article, bookmark it, go to that article, and just look up what that means, because it's probably in there. And if not, let me know and I'll add it.
Awesome. I'm going to check that out as well and see what stuff I got wrong today.
No, I think you were totally right with everything you said. And yeah, it's I don't know. Things like these sound boring if you hear the topic, but they're so important. And I think we all, even if you're a little more experienced, we all from time to time come across things that are confusing or that we just don't understand right away. And it's just worth talking about.
The worst thing about getting started in recording is having to do things twice because you screw something up. You know, you're like, okay, I'm going to spend like an hour or a whole day recording this song. And then you look back at it and you're like, there's like buzz through this entire guitar and there's no getting rid of it. And if you just understood how to use a ground lift or something like that, solve these problems before they ruin your entire day's work, you'll be really glad that you spent the time learning your gear.
Yeah. Also the insecurity, like I always like to just get the gear out of the way, because gear is, on the one hand, gear is fun. Of course, we all love gear. But on the other hand, it kind of gets in the way of the creative process sometimes. And if you're constantly thinking or worrying about all the switches, and if you might have made a mistake and you're not sure if you use that or not, and it's a distraction. And if you can be confident and you just know what all the controls do, you know when to use what, and you don't have to think about it at all, you just move on and document whatever you're doing, then you are in a much, much better place than constantly like worrying and being insecure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I hope this was great, guys. And thank you for listening as always.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Bye. Bye.